Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning, Cedar Mill. I love to hear all of the chat. Good morning, Tom. Good morning, back from college. Come on. Good morning, Autumn. Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, as Julie said, I'm Pastor Ashley. I am so grateful to be here this morning. And the Thanksgiving side dish I like is all the dishes. I like every single thing at Thanksgiving because I feel like all the foods really go well mixed together. And I don't like to mix my food, but the Thanksgiving foods taste good mixed together. Am I right? Oh, some claps. Well, we feel strongly. Yes, Karen, we feel strongly about that. I agree. I do apologize, kids, if you're trying to listen and you want to ask really good questions. If it's a little bit boring, I apologize, but stick with me. Stick with me, pay attention, quiz your family, and if they can't answer all the questions you ask, they owe you $10. Per parent. Tell them I said so. That'll be great. $10 per parent. I don't know if you all are familiar with the movie My Best Friend's Wedding. It is one of my favorite movies, and I don't even like rom-coms all that much, but I love this rom-com. It came out way back in the day. Some of you weren't even born when it came out, but it is a movie about two best friends who decide that if they are not married by the ripe old age of 28, I'm kidding, 28 is not old, that they would marry each other. What ends up happening in this movie is that one day the male best friend calls Julia Roberts, his character, and says, "Hey, I have something that I want to talk to you about later." They end up having a discussion later, and she's thinking, "Oh my gosh, he is going to pop the question. We're both 28. Neither one of us are married. We need to get married. He's going to ask me to marry him." Well, he calls. And he says something like this, "Hey, it's good to talk to you. I've fallen in love and I'm getting married." And guess what? It's not to her. It's to this other woman. So she is so devastated. That movie ends with her actually being the maid of honor at her best friend's wedding and not getting married to her best friend. But anyway, you're probably wondering, what in the world does that have with the book to do with the book of Nehemiah? And I will tell you this, it has absolutely nothing to do with the book of Nehemiah, other than there are some parties, there's some singing, there's some dancing, and they both have a not so happily ever after ending. The big difference, though, between the book of Nehemiah and My Best Friend's Wedding is that the director of the journey of Nehemiah is all about working in and through the not so happily ever after to create an ever after where the people of God experience the restorative power of the presence of God. And so the book of Nehemiah ends with a people whose stick-to-itiveness to their commitments to God has fizzled out. You all may remember that last week Pastor Dave gave us the definition of stick-to-itiveness. Let me remind us what that is. Stick-to-itiveness is the quality that allows someone to continue trying to do something even though it is difficult or unpleasant. Stick-to-itiveness is like perseverance or grit. Those are two other words for it. In the previous chapters, at the height of their stickiness, I will say, they decided to commit and dedicate themselves to the Lord in some pretty specific ways. They decided to be uncompromised in their worship, committed to the Sabbath, and committed to community, as well as to care for the temple. They wanted to honor God by not compromising their worship to Jesus and by establishing routines and schedules that not only created space for worship, but helped them to remain committed to keeping the Sabbath and caring for the temple of their Lord. They agreed to do all of these things, but somehow, the people who were once so dedicated to God moved from uncompromising to lax, committed to dismissive, unified to disjointed, and caring to neglectful. And now they find themselves in willful disregard of God's ways, falling back into old patterns that led to compromise and loss of identity, and consequently, feeding and fueling their love for competing interests and other gods. They find themselves yet again in need of restoration. So how on earth did we get here? Just a chapter ago, you all may remember that everyone was living their best life. They were loving and celebrating the completion of the wall and the God who made it all possible, their deliverer, their redeemer. They rejoiced fervently and passionately, and now they are treating the ways of God as an afterthought. So before we dive in to the last chapter of Nehemiah, let's remember where we've been. We began our journey with Nehemiah praying, pouring out his heart, confessing and lamenting over the sins of his people, and a broken, shattered wall. This is where we find the first of Nehemiah's 14 prayers in Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah was heartsick that the survivors of exile were in great trouble and disgrace because the walls of Jerusalem were broken down and burned. It says that Nehemiah wept and mourned and fasted for days. When was the last time you were so brokenhearted for a person, a place, or a situation that you wept, mourned, and fasted for days? Nehemiah then, being cupbearer to the king, as he often did, he went to do his job. He went face to face to the king, but the king saw him and noticed that Nehemiah was sad. So much so that the king asked him outright, "Why does your face look so sad?" He was depressed. From there, we see that Nehemiah's grief had a profound effect on both the king and the queen, so much so that the Spirit of God moves their hearts to use their power to act, to give Nehemiah exactly what he needed, to do whatever he needed to do to make a difference for his people. So Nehemiah makes the journey to Jerusalem. He rallies the people for the rebuild, knowing that no one person can and should do the work alone, as Steve said, but this work was going to take everybody. This is actually a picture of Shalom and his daughters doing the work. Everybody was a part of the rebuilding process. So they start rebuilding, and in spite of persistent opposition, they resisted that opposition and they persevered, and finally the wall was finished and dedicated. And then everybody got their party on. They broke out the disco balls and the glow sticks and the choirs and the turntables and the roller skates. They didn't have any of these things, but I'm making it up. Picture your best party scene, because the wall was done. It says they danced on the wall, literally. In the face of opposition, God did a thing, and that was worth celebrating. God renewed and restored and empowered the people of God to live anew. And as we heard last week, they had decided to commit to that process through their worship, through Sabbath, through community, and through caring for the temple. Their stick-to-itiveness was an all-time high. And so today, the sermon is really going to focus on what it looks like for the people of God to continue to renew their commitment to holiness. Because as you will see, the people lost their stickiness. And holiness is this. Holiness is to live a set-apart life that is reflected by an ongoing commitment to making Jesus Lord of our lives. It's more than just changing our actions or just not sinning anymore, but it's a heart transformation. You see, people here decided to change their actions, but their hearts were left behind. And holiness involves our actions and our hearts. 1 Peter 1:14-16 says, "As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, 'Be holy because I am holy.'" Author and pastor Paul David Tripp talks about holiness in this way. Here's the best way to understand it. You are holy and you have been called to be holy. If you are God's child, you stand before him as righteous because the perfect righteousness of Jesus has been given over to your personal account. But there's a second aspect of this. You are holy because you have been bought with the blood of Jesus and you are not your own. To say you are holy means that you have been set apart by God's grace for God's purpose. Your allegiance is no longer to the kingdom of your success and happiness, but to the progress of his kingdom of glory and grace. And where do you do this? You do this wherever you are, whomever you're with, and in whatever you're doing. Chapter 13 finds Nehemiah entering his last year as governor. This chapter highlights for us the challenges that the people of God faced when it came to maintaining a lifestyle that enables them to walk in holiness with community integrity wherever they were, whomever they were with, and whatever they were doing. After the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt and the people returned to their commitments that they made with God, we read about a series of events that go down that start affecting their holiness. And we see that there was a struggle between holiness and compromise. And before any one of us is tempted to remove ourselves from the conversation, I want to remind us that at one time or another, because none of us are perfect, right? We have all struggled with the temptation to compromise our values or our principles. And at times, maybe we have compromised those things. And if you haven't compromised or been tempted to compromise some of those things, be on your guard, because you will, especially in the days ahead. This chapter serves as a powerful reminder for us to renew our pursuit and commitment to holiness in our lives and in our communities on a regular basis. This is something that we have to be in continuous prayer about. So what are the things that are affecting their holiness and consequently affecting their integrity as a community? And there's 3 areas that are affecting their holiness. And it's a direct consequence to how they broke those original commitments. So they've lost their holiness in their identity, holiness in obedience, and holiness in action and community integrity. Their holiness, their set-apartness can no longer be seen in their identity, their obedience, or their actions, and they needed to be renewed and restored to a place where they could honor God in their life, to be a holy and set-apart people. So let's get to our first point. Now, I'm not going to read through the whole chapter of Nehemiah, but I'll do some summarizing. And I challenge you to read it because there's some parts in there that are pretty crazy, like where Nehemiah pulls out a dude's beard hair, which sounds wild because it is. Anyway, we're not going to read that, but it happens. So these areas where the people of Israel have failed, they failed to live set-apart lives as they were commanded. They let outside influences into their life. Who or what are the outside influence that maybe you are tempted to let into your life? And they neglected to care for the temple. And Nehemiah is encouraging them to come back. Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem and find all of these things done away with. He goes and he particularly finds out that Tobiah, who is an enemy of the Israelites, is actually living in the temple. He had moved in. He is squatting in the temple of God with all of his things, this unholy person, and a priest had let him do so. And the reason why this is bad is because Tobiah was representing the enemy, evil. He meant to do harm. He was there to gain political influence. He was there to use the people of God. And so Nehemiah took swift action and kicked him out. He decided decisively to do so. And there are some things in our life that we need to decisively decide to get rid of. And so as he kicked Nehemiah out, commentators say that this is reflective of when Jesus cleanses the temple. It reminds us of John 2:16 through 17, where it says, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Do we have zeal for the Father's house? After Nehemiah kicks Tobiah out and purifies it, he also addresses the failure of the people to provide for the Levites in offering the required temple services. So the Levites were supposed to be actually benefiting from the temple, but because Tobiah had moved in and some other things were going on, they actually had to move out of the temple, and they weren't being benefited at all by this. This was wrong. So Nehemiah had to restore and make that right. Holiness needs to be restored in the people's identity. And the compromises that they've made, that we've made in our life, must be confronted. The people had made a covenant to separate themselves from the influences that aren't of God and to live set-apart lives, and yet they found themselves compromising that commitment. We too have to remember our commitments to God. How often do we let these little influences creep in and distract and keep us from the promises of God? Worldly influence that lead us away from our commitment to Jesus. We are called to reflect and identify those things and stand firm on what we believe. And so we have to pause and remember the things that God is calling us to do that make us distinct in this world so that we are not led away from the promises of God. We have to maintain our distinction as the people of God. We've talked about identity already in this series, but that can't be talked about enough here. There's value and importance in remembering who you are, because when we forget who we are and whose we are, we forget our foundation and anything goes at that point. This is true in our personal lives, and this is true when it comes to the church. Alexander Hamilton famously said, I'm not going to sing that musical. I don't know any of the songs, but the president, Alexander Hamilton, once said, "Those who stand for nothing will fall for anything. What are you standing for today?" In our lives, we must confront the compromises that creep into our hearts and churches, because ultimately it will affect our identity, and not just our identity, but it will affect how others perceive us. It is essential to take a stand, just as Nehemiah did, to ensure that our spiritual homes, meaning our churches, are free from corruption, that our allegiances are not to one man or one woman, but to God, not money, to God, not nation, to God, not self. It never ceases to amaze me that the people of God are willing to chip away at their integrity of their faith for temporary satisfaction or to gain favor in the eyes of someone who has power or influence. We can't do that. Okay, let's move on. You all get it. Holiness in obedience. And here we find that the people have stopped keeping Sabbath holy, which means they've really essentially stopped committing to worship and creating sacred space. Nehemiah noticed that they had turned the temple again into a marketplace on the day of rest. So he rebuked the nobles and took measures to protect the sanctity of Sabbath. This speaks to the importance of rest and reflection in our own busy lives. Are we honoring God with our time? Are we making space to honor God? Or is our to-do list too full and money too important? We have this thing when it comes to rest that we think rest isn't productive enough. Rest is actually very productive when it comes to the Lord. Sabbath is one of the ways that we honor God and we allow Him to fill and renew us. It is a gift to us, a time to refocus our hearts and minds on Him. We must create space for this because it affects our worship, space for rest, space for renewal in our lives. Resisting the temptation to fill every moment with work or what we have deemed to be productive. Sabbath literally means to cease, to stop. It has always struck me strange that the commandment that we are okay with breaking is remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Isn't that odd? That's the one. Hebrews 4:9 says to us, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And maybe for some of you, Sabbath is a new thing. It's a hard thing. But I've put in the discussion questions this week a little link to a little booklet that helps you start engaging with Sabbath, not just as an individual, but as a whole family. What does that mean for you? And not in a legalistic way, but in a way that helps you to honor God and renew your body and your mind and pursue holiness. Lastly, we find holiness in action and community integrity. Here, the people have forgotten to, again, remember who they are, and they need to be restored fully. Here, identity comes up again. And as we look to restoration and renewing our commitment to follow God and pursuing holiness, it's important not only to remember who we are, but who we've been asked to be. Nehemiah, in verses 23 through 31, confronts the issue of intermarriage with foreign nations. Now, what I want to say here is this scripture has been misused to hurt and oppress people. This is not what Nehemiah is talking about here. Nehemiah is reminding us here that influence can lead us astray, especially when those influences are not people or things that follow Jesus, particularly people. When we are letting people that we love that don't follow Jesus into our inner circle, it has the ability to change what God is asking us to do. We are called to be in the world, but not of it. The relationships that we cultivate can either strengthen our faith or weaken it. So we have to be vigilant about the company that we keep, especially romantically. Single people, I'm a single person, so I'm going to talk to us. If there's any single people in the room, don't worry, I'm not going to make you raise your hand. You do not have to settle. Please don't settle. Find someone, yes, find someone who loves the Lord. Find someone who worships Jesus. Find someone who challenges you to do the same thing. Find someone who is committed to pursuing holiness and pursuing Jesus. They don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be saved. I'm sorry. I know. That's hard. They do need to be saved, because what will happen is you will get pulled away from the Lord. And that is what Nehemiah is addressing here. He doesn't want any influence to pull you away from God. And there's some other influences that single people and married people alike can think through. There's a lot of things in this world. Not everything that is spiritual is of God. Some things we need to put away immediately. New Age Christianity, our crystals, our tarot cards, whatever is going on. I was scrolling on TikTok the other day, and I kept getting tarot card readings, and I was like, what is this? Not everything that is spiritual is of God, and you don't need to be open to everything. Don't let people trick you into believing that. It is not true. Be mindful of what you're letting into your life that influences you. Don't do it. Be discerning in the content that you're digesting. At times, we can get sucked in to relationships and material, and we can forget who we are. Galatians 5:9 says this: a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. The Lion King is one of my favorite movies as a kid. I love The Lion King. I still love it. I just watched it the other day. There's a new movie coming out, just in case you didn't know, in a couple of weeks, or maybe Christmas. Go see it. If it's bad, don't tell me about it. The Lion King is one of my favorite movies, and there's a great scene in there. You know, when Mufasa has been killed, tragic, sad. Simba is told by Scar that it's his fault, and he runs off, and he lives with Timon and Pumbaa, a warthog and whatever the other thing was. Muskrat, there we go. Whatever kind of animal that was. He runs off and he lives with them, and he starts taking on that identity, and they were lovely and sweet people, but this whole Hakuna Matata thing was not Simba's call. So one day, Simba is reminded by a vision from his father and the voice of James Earl Jones, which I cannot do, the late great. He says, "You are more than what you have become. Remember who you are, Simba." You see, when we forget that we are God's children and that we are beloved, we end up compromising areas where we thought we never would, or doing things that we shouldn't, or believing things that were never true. And it's time to stand firm on what we believe in every way. What do you believe today? Solidify that. Nanny Helen Burroughs, educator, civil rights activist, and one of the original founders of the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention, back in the day, said this to leaders in her time: what we need are mental and spiritual giants who are aflame with purpose. Are you a mental and spiritual giant today? Are you aflame with purpose? In the closing verses of Nehemiah, he emphasizes the importance of fidelity to God's commitments. And that's what I want to emphasize today. Fidelity to God's commitments through the pursuit of holiness. Nehemiah reminds us that our commitment to God is not a one-time event. And I'm not talking about salvation here, right? Salvation, yes, it's a one-time event. But your relationship with Jesus, your obedience to Jesus is not a one-time event. It is a continual journey. It is a daily choice. When you wake up in the morning, who is it that you decide to follow? My hope is that we would be led to examine our lives through chapter 13. That we would be asking ourselves the question, are we living in accordance to the will of God? Are we actively working to foster a community that honors Him? Are we actively working to help our family foster an atmosphere to worship Him? And are we committed to pursuing holiness? Hebrews 10:36 says this, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. We are called to remember our commitments and to commit them, to honor the Sabbath, be mindful of our relationships, renew our dedication to God. Just as Nehemiah fervently sought to restore the integrity of Jerusalem, we too must fervently seek to restore and maintain the integrity and holiness in our lives and in our community. Let us pray for the strength and courage to live lives that reflect our commitment to God and His purpose in this day. We do this because we know, I hope we know, that our happily ever after can only be found in the pursuit of holiness. The pursuit of holiness by choosing obedience to God daily. The pursuit of holiness by choosing integrity in every area of our life. The pursuit of holiness in choosing to maintain the sacred from the secular. The choosing of pursuing holiness by pursuing God in prayer, being committed to pray, being reminded when we do this that sin and evil have no control over us, that injustice does not rule and corruption and Satan are not king. Do you realize that today? We have the victory over Satan. God is and will always be worthy of your trust. He is holy. And so as the worship team and the prayer team make their way to the stage, I want to remind us that God's heart is always for restoration. In restoration, we find peace. We find wholeness. A just God who sent Jesus to love just for you and me, to redeem and restore. If any part of you this morning is in need of restoration, a restoration of mind, a restoration of your commitment to obedience, a restoration of your commitment to love people, a restoration of joy, maybe, a restoration of peace, or maybe there's some other area in your life where you're feeling, you know what, I need restoration in this area, and she didn't name it. Please, 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 take advantage of our prayer team. I want to read this scripture to you from Romans 12, 1 through 2. The pursuit of holiness is part of our act of worship. Paul says this, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. if you need prayer as we move into this song, please come forward and be prayed for.